It's May 28, 1940, a little before 5 p.m. south of Abbeville. Over 6,000 French shells strike Houpigny in under an hour. After the shelling ends, around 100 French tanks attack German positions from the woods. The German troops' attacks bounce off the armor of the powerful French B-1 bis tanks. The German infantry eventually breaks. The survivors speak of monstrous steel fortresses that crush anti-tank guns without slowing down, shatter their defensive positions, and nothing can stop them. By day's end, the French captured several hundred prisoners and advanced 5 kilometers. They will do even better the next day, forcing the highest-ranking German officers to come to the front lines to try to contain the rout of their men as the front line threatens to collapse. Leading this attack is a colonel, recently appointed temporary general by the new commander-in-chief Weygand. This officer's name is Charles de Gaulle. And yet 6 days later, Abbeville will still be in German hands, despite 3 successive waves of assaults. But why? That's what we're going to find out today. Here's some brief context to help explain the decisions and determination each side will show during the week-long confrontation. On May 20, 1940, 10 days after the German invasion began and a week before the Battle of Abbeville, Guderian's tanks reached the English Channel coast. The bulk of the German infantry follows with difficulty at an erratic pace, covering crazy distances of 40 to 60 kilometers per day in order to catch up with the mechanized spearhead of the German offensive. This movement is still fragile at this point. However, it's a success for the Germans, as the Allied armies in the north, including the British Expeditionary Force, are cut off from the rest of France and under heavy Wehrmacht pressure. The Dunkirk trap is beginning to close. The Belgian army is on the brink, while British resolve is wavering. Chaos reigns on the Allied side, while the men and officers on the ground show remarkable self-sacrifice, but it is not enough to change the course of events. Another important point, in their race to the sea, the Germans were once again clever, anticipating the next phase of the campaign by establishing more or less solid bridgeheads south of the Somme, especially at Péronne, Corbie, Amiens, Picquigny, and Abbeville. For Berlin, this card is crucial for maintaining a fast offensive after the Dunkirk pocket is cleared. But for Paris, this situation is a deadly threat, and you will soon understand why. It is in this chaotic situation caused both by the brilliant execution of their plan by the Germans and the failure of the strategy implemented by Generalissimo Gamelin that the French army loses no fewer than 30 of its best divisions throughout the month of May. General Weygand, who replaced Gamelin as head of the Allied armies on May 19th, thus urgently tries to launch a counteroffensive while establishing a defensive line along the Somme. But these bridgeheads are also breaches that need to be filled, weakening the French defenses, especially by allowing the armored units to cross the river more easily. If Weygand wants a solid line, he must either reduce these pockets or mobilize resources he doesn't really have in order to contain these bridgeheads. Abbeville is actually just one bridgehead among others. It does not inherently have more importance than the other bridgeheads, such as Amiens or Péronne. During those frantic days, only one thing mattered: urgency. They had to act quickly and counterattack immediately, as all deployed French armies were ordered to do. However, these counteroffensives were carried out in a disorganized and rushed manner, while many divisions were still being repositioned on the future Weygand line. In this context, 3 Allied armored divisions played a major role in the Battle of Abbeville. The 1st British Armored Division under General Evans, which landed at Cherbourg on May 22nd, the 2nd French Armored Division under Colonel Perrin, and the 4th French Armored Division under Colonel de Gaulle. The 1st British Armored Division is only ready to attack on May 27th, which is too late to immediately push back the German bridgehead at Abbeville, which has a week to establish itself before being reinforced by the 57th German Infantry Division. The 2nd Armored Division is in a pitiful state, shattered and partially destroyed. By May 27th, it exists only in name. Despite this, the elements that make it up and which Colonel Perrin controls managed to reduce 3 small bridgeheads on the Somme during their transfer to the Abbeville sector. However, the colonel believes that they will not be operational on site until June 1st at the earliest, with a potential of 171 tanks, of which 137 are light, if all goes well. Colonel de Gaulle's 4th DCR, on the other hand, was cobbled together only on May 10, 1940. It is incomplete, made up of brave but inexperienced crews, and has suffered heavily in its battles at Montcornet and Crécy-sur-Serre. The colonel has 32 B-1 bis heavy tanks and 105 light tanks, 20 Somuas, 20 Hotchkiss, and 65 Renault R-35s. Coordination is lacking, and each force pursues different objectives. The Allied plan to cut off the spearhead of the German offensive, as Churchill and Weygand proposed, does not work in practice. Meanwhile, General Gort, in charge of the British Expeditionary Force, wants the 1st British Armored Division to come to his aid by following the coast, which logically takes them through Abbeville. However, the operational situation of the Allied forces does not allow for a massive, rapid counteroffensive, let alone mobilize additional resources to simultaneously reduce the bridgeheads on the Somme. Several days pass in a certain confusion, leading to orders and counterorders, contributing to the Allied chaos without any significant results. On May 26th, Weygand realizes the British are acting independently and preparing to leave, while his armies can no longer launch a large coordinated counteroffensive. He then gives the order to reduce the 3 main bridgeheads on the Somme, which are Abbeville, Amiens, and Péronne. And that's how, on May 27, 1940, a British division driven by its own objectives is ready to launch an assault on Abbeville without real coordination with the French High Command. For his part, the 4th Armored Division of Colonel de Gaulle, whose new rank of Brigadier General will only become effective on June 1st, is hurrying to launch the attack as soon as possible. His men and armored vehicles will be ready to launch the assault on May 28 in the late afternoon. As for the 2nd Armored Division, as mentioned, it is in such a state of disorganization and confusion that it simply cannot take part in the first 2 phases of the battle. But we will have the opportunity to come back to this. On the German side, the balance of power is actually not really in their favor. It's essentially the German 2nd Motorized Division, certainly well equipped with anti-tank equipment, that is holding the position, while the 57th Infantry Division is gradually arriving to relieve them. And it is in this context that General Evans launches the largest Allied counteroffensive of 1940, the Battle of Abbeville. It's General Evans's 1st Armored Division that kicks things off on May 27, 1940, but the haste of the offensive and the disorganization of the division perfectly illustrate the Allied situation at this stage of the war. The division landed in France a few days earlier without its artillery, some of its tanks, or the infantry that was supposed to accompany it. However, it is hastily supported by the 5th French Light Cavalry Division, which itself is reduced to about 20 armored vehicles. But the attack is a fiasco. From the start, German anti-tank guns of the 2nd Motorized Infantry Division, hidden behind hedges, break the attack's momentum and use the terrain effectively. The British light tanks such as the Crusader and Vickers, whose armor offers no effective protection against German anti-tank shells, are simply slaughtered. German Corporal Brinfort alone destroys no fewer than 11 British tanks in 20 minutes, with a 37mm anti-tank gun. The day's outcome is simply disastrous for the Allies. Out of the 180 British tanks engaged, 120 are put out of action. The French liaison officer who was present alongside the British, while being impressed by the courage and discipline of the British tank crews, shares this damning testimony. The English tanks made poor use of their agility and speed, acting with a frustrating discipline, as if on exercise and according to the tactics they had been taught. Instead of moving quickly and firing their machine guns, they slowed down to aim, making themselves vulnerable to armor-piercing shells. The German 37mm anti-tank guns thus had time to aim at them and fire. Armor-piercing shells would enter one side and exit the other. The tanks would burst into flames with their crews killed, resulting in absolutely horrific losses. Only one French detachment, that of Captain Gregoire from the 5th Light Cavalry Division, achieved a local success that was merely anecdotal in the context of this first engagement, as they managed to drive the Germans out of the village of Toufflet. But across the front, the first attack failed. The German bridgehead holds, while the 2nd German Motorized Infantry Division gives way to the 57th Infantry Division. Under General Blum, which itself is made up of veterans from the fighting in Poland, well-trained men, and firepower that is 3 times greater than an equivalent French infantry division. In short, it's solid. But the next day, none other than Charles de Gaulle arrives in the sector. Before I tell you about May 28th, likely the documentary's most important day, I want to take 2 minutes to discuss the partner who made this possible. It's Hungry Minds and their book, The Book. I'll be honest, I was initially skeptical about this partnership offer. I already own many great history books and encyclopedias, so it takes something special to interest me. But as I flipped through it, I changed my mind. The book is an illustrated encyclopedia, without AI, of course, that lists the great inventions and discoveries of humanity. The book covers 180 topics in 23 chapters across more than 400 pages. From agriculture to semiconductors, from early metallurgy to modern transmission methods. What drew me in beyond the aesthetics is the approach. It's not a textbook, but rather a cool cabinet of curiosities, where each 2-page spread is crafted with remarkable visual care, blending the look of 19th century engravings with the precision of engineering blueprints. You can honestly open the book at random and find an interesting topic. For example, I was really drawn to botany, agriculture, and medicinal plants, but not only those. To give you an example that resonates with today's topic, the book devotes pages to several major innovations that led to military uses, including tanks, which are at the heart of our topic today. As for the production, it's very well done. There's a laminated hardcover, quality matte paper, in a format you'd gladly leave on the coffee table to take a look at from time to time. The project itself raised over $2 million on Kickstarter and was a bestseller in 2023 with its Italian publisher, and now it's coming out in its French version. In short, it's the kind of book that belongs in the library of someone who's curious, or even makes a great gift for a friend, a relative, or yourself. To get your copy, head to the link in the description and use the code D-Mystif, Histoire Dix, to get a 10% discount. By purchasing through this link with this code, you also directly support the channel. Now let's go back to May 1940, south of Abbeville. On May 28th, in the late afternoon, Colonel de Gaulle is preparing to launch his attack. The 4th Armored Division has existed for only 3 weeks. Already engaged at Montcornet and Crécy-sur-Serre, it has suffered in those battles. And it fields only 137 tanks, including 32 heavy tanks, the famous B-1Bis, and 105 light tanks. And this is an interesting point to keep in mind because it says a lot about the constant gap in May 1940 between the theoretical order of battle and the reality on the ground. On paper, a French armored division is supposed to field a little over 200 tanks, including 70 heavy tanks, while in practice, the 4th DCR has to make do with just over 2/3 of that theoretical strength, and less than half of those heavy tanks. Not to mention that at this stage of the war, after 2 weeks of fierce fighting, as well as tanks that were rushed out of the factories only partially finished, and constant movements in all directions, many of the tanks it fields are not in good condition. In short, on paper the 4th DCR is powerful, but on the ground it is weakened. But even so, the plan that de Gaulle lays out is clear. He wants to concentrate his forces at a single point, launching an attack from the south. The objective is to take the ridge to the west of Cheneville, then push on to Mount Coubert. This 82-meter summit overlooks the entire Abbeville bridgehead and is the real key to it. The southern approach, contrary to what one might think, is not the easy option. It is dictated by the terrain, whose vegetation allows the tanks to be hidden from the view of the German artillery during the first kilometers of the advance. And this is important because de Gaulle is aware that his division is unbalanced, made up of many novice tank crews, while it is severely lacking in radios and is also understaffed. He must move quickly, so he skips a thorough reconnaissance, choosing a direct approach that allows him to concentrate his resources at a single point, rather than scattering his forces. In a more subtle maneuver, but one that requires more preparation, more information as well about the German positions, and which in itself is obviously more demanding in terms of coordination. Less agile than the maneuvers of a general like Rommel, it's nevertheless a pragmatic decision given the time he has and the resources available. The attack thus begins on May 28th in the late afternoon at precisely 4:45 p.m. with heavy artillery fire. 6,000 shells hit German positions in Houpigny village in under an hour. After the artillery stops, the powerful B-1Bs tanks lead the attack, followed by light tanks, the 22nd Colonial Infantry Regiment, and the 4th Battalion of Motorized Chasseurs. After some difficulties due to the lack of reconnaissance, which caused some tanks to go off course or get stuck in the rough terrain, the French make contact. Opposite them, the German 37mm anti-tank guns fire repeatedly, but have no effect. Their shells ricochet off the armor of the B-1Bs, and a German soldier reports, "These French giants with thick armor are indifferent to impacts, even at close range. Despite direct hits up to 20 in a row, the shells ricochet while these unfeeling monsters keep moving forward. Our anti-tank guns are crushed." The most incredible part is that this assault is being carried out almost blind. The few radios in some tanks quickly stop working. But to compensate for this as best they can, de Gaulle and his officers take risks and move closer to the front in order to gather as much information as possible, allowing them to try to follow the developments of the situation as closely as possible. When nightfall forces the French advance to stop, German losses are heavy. De Gaulle doesn't know yet, but the German front is starting to collapse before his tanks. The first German lines have been brutally torn apart. For example, a German battalion that began the day with 750 men ends with just 75 still fighting, while several hundred Germans are captured. Houpigny fell at 9:30 p.m., followed by Caumont, Bellevue, and the Fréchancourt woods. A soldier from the 4th DCR perfectly sums up the day's fighting when he observes the battlefield at first light the next morning. Behind the curtain of a courageous defense lies the clear mark of a rout. In short, the conclusion is clear. The German front has been breached, causing heavy losses in a rout similar to what the French units experienced on the Meuse just 2 weeks earlier. German units are retreating in disorder toward Abbeville, leaving equipment behind and spreading defeatist rumors. The situation is so serious that the famous General von Manstein, in charge of the sector, goes there himself to try to restore order, while Field Marshal von Kluge, commanding the German Fourth Army, authorizes a retreat north of the Somme if he fails to calm the men. When you know how rigid the German command is about this bridgehead, this decision illustrates the seriousness of the Wehrmacht's situation on the evening of May 28, 1940. At nightfall, The German front has been breached across nearly 5 kilometers, and the bridgehead, which had a perimeter of 30 kilometers that morning, is now just a quarter of its original size. Thus, the decisive act of the Battle of Abbeville will take place the following day. When the sun rises the next day within the division's command post, this favorable situation is not recognized. Due to poor communication, the tank battalion spent the night accounting for themselves and signaling so officers knew everyone's location and condition. No thorough reconnaissance can be done by the French, so de Gaulle is unaware the Germans are collapsing ahead of his tanks, that von Manstein has entered the sector, and that von Kluge has authorized a withdrawal north of the Somme. The 4th Armored Division is winning a major victory, but its commander does not see it, and once again the lack of effective information transmission risks costing the French their victory, just like at Montcornet. The 4th Armored Division, at the time it is engaged at Abbeville, in fact has no reliable communication system. The tank battalions communicate with each other using flag signals, or by sending an officer to run from tank to deliver an order. Meanwhile, orders and information between the different elements of the division are delivered by motorcycle couriers. As a result, the French strike hard but blindly and have trouble coordinating. This failure was, moreover, perfectly diagnosed by de Gaulle himself as early as January 1944, months earlier, when he wrote, and I quote, "We must find the necessary communications at the battalion level, otherwise our tanks will be outsmarted." And as you will soon understand, on May 29, 1940, these communications are sorely lacking, just as they were at Montcornet. Meanwhile, as the French counted tanks, cared for the wounded, and prepared for the 29th, the Germans responded swiftly. Throughout the night of the 28th to the 29th of May, they sent back to the South Bank the troops that had managed to regroup there, positioned new, heavier cannons, and in particular anti-aircraft batteries, whose powerful shells were capable of piercing heavy armor. When the French attack resumed at 4 a.m. on May 29, the day was expected to be difficult. The 4th Armored Division now moves across open ground. Except for Mount Cobert, the terrain and vegetation that could shield them are now behind them. Now it's a matter of delivering the final blow against a weakened enemy in order to achieve victory. Colonel de Gaulle's men thus achieve new successes. Villers-Mareuil and Mareuil-Cobert fall in the morning. The goal is within reach. After Mount Cobert falls to us, Abbeville will be next. In fact, despite a slight recovery in German morale during the night, the French advance and manage once again to make them falter. General Blum, commander of the German division, is struggling to control his demoralized men who see no solution to the French advance. The accounts of German soldiers from that time describe how contagious panic was spreading again, to the point of sending hundreds of men fleeing blindly, first toward Abbeville, then randomly across the countryside. The famous General von Manstein himself is forced to intervene on the spot, and recounts the seriousness of the situation in his memoirs. The Germans are clearly losing at that point. The front, 30 kilometers long on the morning of the 27th, shrinks to just 3 kilometers by noon on the 29th. The French remain unaware of the panic on the other side. It may sound crazy, but the few French reconnaissance vehicles are unable to get the information back to headquarters. Lieutenant Bridoux, who commands 3 Panhards, which are armored vehicles used for reconnaissance, writes in his notes, "German retreat through the Moyenville-Cambrin Valley." It's a great opportunity. One of his men adds, "We saw the Germans running and running, but our role was not to pursue them. A dispatch writer then told us to turn back, so we turned around." The German front is shattered, Wehrmacht officers are struggling to gather their men, and it's at this moment that the French army can press its advantage and simply achieve a clear, decisive victory, opening a gap in the German offensive. But it's at this moment, at this decisive moment, that the 4th Armored Division sees victory slip away for two reasons: the failing logistics of the French army in 1940 and the lack of an effective communication system to coordinate the forces with each other. From noon on, confusion takes over, but now on the French side. The tanks scout on their own, refuel slowly and in a disorganized way, and try in small groups to move on to Montcobert, where they are met by powerful German 88mm cannons. It would be up to the infantry to finish the job. De Gaulle only realizes he needs to send his infantrymen after receiving information, with about an hour's delay. He orders the dragoon, mentioned earlier, to begin the attack. But once again, by the time the information reaches those concerned, who are 10 kilometers away, with the message carried by motorcycle, by the time it gets to the starting point and becomes operational, it's already 7:30 in the evening. Meanwhile, German infantry, led by Blum and von Manstein, was regrouping its scattered units. Earlier, Abbeville's suburbs were empty of resistance, but now they're filled with motivated Germans. Meanwhile, General Blum takes advantage of the night to concentrate several artillery batteries in support of his infantrymen. On May 30th, after a morning reorganizing, de Gaulle makes a final effort against a German army that has consolidated its positions. The latter start the day with a counteroffensive, but the French repel it. Afterwards, the 4th Armored Division cannot shift the lines in its favor. Importantly, Allied aviation intervenes for the first time in the battle on May 30th. There are thus 7 raids by British bombers, escorted by French fighters, that take place between 5 p.m. and 9:10 p.m. The planes actually managed to interrupt the supply of ammunition to the German heavy artillery, and 2 88mm guns are destroyed. But this air effort, as valuable as it is, comes far too late for a 4th Armored Division that is now exhausted and out of resources. And so, on the evening of May 30th, the day ends in a stalemate. The German assaults in the morning were all repelled, while those of the French broke down in front of the enemy batteries. The outcome of the 4th Armored Division's engagement at Abbeville shows the offensive was exhausted. In 3 days of fighting, from May 28th to 30th, the 4th Armored Division lost 92 tanks out of the 137 engaged, including almost all of its B-1, BS-37 Renault R-35s, and 27 Saumur and Hotchkiss tanks. The division's infantry, for its part, with a strength of 4,522 men, has 800 out of action. These losses will impact the rest of the campaign. But on the other side, the losses of the 57th German Infantry Division, supported by its artillery and various elements from other divisions, are among the highest suffered by a German unit in 1940. 2,300 men are put out of action, 36 anti-tank guns, 5 88mm guns, 6 20mm guns, and nearly 200 machine guns are destroyed. The French army nearly won and dealt heavy damage to its opponent. But once again, it was held back by this structural weakness. Legend has it that de Gaulle wanted to continue an offensive he was about to win. But the French High Command stopped him. As you now see, the reality differs from this story. The offensive of the 4th Armored Division truly came close to victory, but it was only once this momentum was clearly halted that the order to stop the offensive and withdraw was given. But why withdraw? Well, because an armored division is an offensive division. It is not capable of effectively holding ground, since that is not its role. It must yield to an infantry division, better suited for this mission. And it is precisely in this context, on May 30th at 7:30 p.m., once the results of the day have been reported to the French command, that Colonel de Gaulle receives the famous order to stop the attack. One of his liaison officers reports the scene, revealing his character. Crowded with his staff in a small 3-square-meter house by the roadside, de Gaulle flies into a violent rage and at first refuses to obey. He then shouts, "It's now, I'm sure of it, that the Germans are crossing the Abbeville bridges again. It's now that we should go." His staff insists that the order makes sense, and after persistent arguments, he is finally persuaded. After one last gesture of impatience, he declares, Let's go. And that's the whole paradox of this scene. By his very anger, de Gaulle implicitly acknowledges what he refuses to admit openly. He actually understood perfectly well that the Germans have regained a foothold and are continuing to consolidate their positions, meaning that his offensive, despite its initial successes, ended up being stalled. Without saying it, he knows that the opportunity he had, the chance to permanently destroy this German bridgehead, has slipped away from him, and that the order he has been given, as frustrating as it may be for him, is now the right one. But this battle is not over yet. Now, it is Colonel Perrin's second DCR that will have the difficult mission of attempting the final strike. The exhausted 4th DCR is thus relieved by General Fortune's 51st Scottish Infantry Division, which happens to be the last operational British division still present on the continent. It is an experienced and fresh infantry division that has not been involved in the fighting in the north and at Dunkirk. It is then reinforced by the 31st French Infantry Division and Colonel Perrin's 2nd Armored Division. It is to British General Fortune that the commander of the 10th Army, General Altmaier, orders to launch a new offensive against Abbeville, relying on the 2nd Armored Division. The Allied command corrects its strategy this time. Rather than a frontal attack from the south, it will be an attack carried out from the west and partly at night in order to try to surprise the 57th Infantry Division, which it is believed no longer expects a major new offensive after the violent fighting of the previous days. But preparing for this third offensive is very slow. While the operation is decided on the morning of June 1st, it takes 2 full days for the 2nd Armored Division to gather not the 171 tanks initially anticipated, but only 107 tanks, including 21 B-1BIs, and then an additional day to conduct reconnaissance and prepare the offensive. The attack thus begins only on the morning of June 4th, and this slowness in execution gives the Germans several days to strengthen their positions by learning from their encounters with Colonel de Gaulle's tanks. They also gain reinforcements as the second phase of the German offensive is prepared. They also fill the area with anti-tank mines and guns of all calibers, including about 20 formidable 88mm guns that have proven effective against the 4th Armored Division's tanks. Unlike the 4th Armored Division, whose tanks were poorly equipped with radios, the 2nd Armored Division has working communications. The presence of multiple divisions also allows for a better, multi-angle assessment of the situation. However, these advantages are insufficient, as the latest Allied offensive lasts only the better part of the morning. Following a 3 a.m. Allied artillery barrage, the French tanks set off in the dark. When the first sunlight appears, French armored vehicles hit German mines and a strong defense. For their part, the Franco-British infantry is separated from the tanks by German machine gun fire, and without offensive momentum or cohesion with the armored attack, they do not follow and cannot consolidate the positions taken by the armored vehicles. As a result, the front line does not move despite the incursion of 2 B-1BS tanks at the top of Mount Coburg, which find themselves alone there and are therefore forced to retreat to the rear. In a few hours, the matter is settled. The Germans are now too well entrenched. Colonel Perrin loses 38 tanks there, no fewer than 14 of which are lost due to mechanical problems, and he must acknowledge the failure of the offensive commanded by British General Fortune. The Allied attack on Abbeville has just ended. The next day, on June 5, 1940, the Wehrmacht launches Fall Rot, the second phase of the Battle of France and the major offensive against the Weygand Line, which we mentioned in a previous documentary. From then on, Abbeville is no longer a priority, while the Allied troops who fought on the slopes of Mount Coburg must now face the German juggernaut on the Somme. Next, it is the formidable 7th Panzer Division under General Rommel that destabilizes the Allied defenses in the sector between Abbeville and Amiens, using railway bridges that the French had not destroyed. It locally destabilizes the Weygand line, which does not collapse but still makes it easier for the Germans to advance using their various bridgeheads. This Battle of Abbeville, which took place in 3 phases, is both an excellent illustration of the causes of the Allied defeat during the Battle of France and of the very real qualities of the French army in 1940. First of all, the fact that this battle took place in 3 phases, which were poorly coordinated and spread out over a little more than a week, perfectly illustrates the Allied problem of slow decision-making, even longer movements, and coordination that was completely off. When General Evans, following an objective different from that of the French, took the initiative to launch his assault alone, supported by the few French units lingering in the area, it was a costly mistake, benefiting no one, and resulted in the destruction of the bulk of British armored power in just a few hours. One can only imagine the impact and success a British offensive might have had if it began a day later, alongside Colonel de Gaulle's maneuvers. The other point involves both personnel and equipment. British tank crews, though brave, lack effectiveness, while French crews fight well and more pragmatically. On the equipment side, the British tanks are not suited for the operations expected of them, while the French tanks, and especially the B-1BIS, are both extremely effective but require heavy logistical support that the French army is unable to provide during operations. Another major point is that without modern coordination, meaning with the help of radios, it is impossible to quickly exploit the breaches that the French tanks managed to open. The arrival of a second understrength armored division on site, 4 days after the main fighting ended, did not help, as it was unable to launch a rapid offensive despite Colonel Perrin's efforts, who was more a victim of the situation than its cause. The author illustrates how much the French armored divisions were designed only for localized breach plugging operations, within a prepared and well-defined sector. Outside of this context, among the 4 French armored divisions, only the 4th Armored Division, under Colonel de Gaulle, whose doctrine is more offensive, seems to manage. But at the same time, the French engagement at Abbeville shows that the French army in 1940 had the men, the essential equipment, and the moral strength that make victories possible. It fails here, once again, under the weight of its own doctrinal errors, while the Wehrmacht once again demonstrates remarkable speed and adaptability. But on June 5, 1940, the matter was not yet settled. A new Battle of France was beginning, and that's what I suggest we look at together right after a quick closing remark. This episode again demanded careful, detailed work from me, consulting multiple sources that often disagree. And so I hope I was able to help you understand what really happened at Abbeville, without the biased or even political interpretations of the event. And if you think this work deserves it, please leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts with me in the comments. Moreover, as you have seen, this documentary is illustrated with archival footage, and a large part of it is licensed, which represents a significant cost for the channel, since we have to purchase them, not to mention all the other expenses inherent in creating all these documentaries. In the current YouTube landscape, D-Mystif no longer covers its costs, and that's exactly what TP is for. If you believe that this work deserves to exist and to be freely accessible to as many people as possible on YouTube, you can support the channel on the Typee page, the link to which is in the description. Every contribution, even just €1 or €2 a month, goes directly to keeping the channel running and continuing to make documentaries. Without you, D-Mystif, Histoire will eventually disappear, but with you, the fight goes on. With that, discover how Generalissimo Weygand tried to change the course of history in June 1940.